When last we studied, we looked at Proverbs introducing itself. Proverbs 1, 1 through 7. We looked at ideas such as to know, to understand, to learn, to teach. The Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, to know wisdom and instruction, to perceive, that is, to understand the words of understanding. We're going to revisit those verses. We're going to revisit them as well as the ones that following, to receive the instruction of wisdom, justice, judgment, equity, to give subtlety to the simple, to the young man, knowledge and discretion. The reason we need to revisit those verses is because of how integral the truths contained therein are to not only to our society today, but to our mindsets. And not just today, but frankly, this generation and all of our generations, so to speak, all combined and accumulated into one. 2016, July 5th. Anyone remember the name Alton Sterling? What if I mention Baton Rouge? Police shooting. I know Brother Schmidt does. July 6, 2016. Philandro Castile, Minneapolis, Minnesota. For what seemed like years on end, every month, sometimes it seemed like every week, there was another event in the news that typically involved an officer-involved shooting. Now, the reason we bring that up is to say this. Every time those events made headlines, they were centered on what topic? And don't say bullets. What was the primary disparity that was drawing the focus? Race. Every time. And every time, no matter where you were, there were people that may have lived 20 miles away, 200 miles away, 2,000 miles away, that already knew exactly what the thought processes were, the reasonings were, the exact events were, even after they only read a headline. And the result, in almost every community, was tension. Why? Because we're dumb enough to think we can read each other's minds. Because we're arrogant enough to think that we know everything. Because we are presumptuous enough to think that we need not look at evidence in order to know the answers. Has anything changed? Have our mindsets changed and our reasonings changed? Has anybody stopped for a moment to think, could my view possibly be wrong? Could I possibly be lacking enough facts to arrive at a full conclusion? Could there be a need to change a mentality as it pertains to my perception of the world around me and current events? Is there a chance that I might need to change my preconceptions? Same bias approaches to investigating, same biased approaches to examining evidence for those that actually would examine evidence. They so frequently did so only in an echo chamber. What's the definition of insanity? To do the same thing over and over and expect different results. A small group of Christians, be it a congregation in Memphis, Tennessee, Nashville, Tennessee, Birmingham, Alabama, New York, wherever that small group of Christians might be. Maybe they are in a backwoods area of you name the state. A small group of Christians cannot hope to resolve all of the tension that exists throughout society for the simple fact that we can't force every person in society to forfeit their prejudices. However, what we can do is resolve not to be part of the problem. When those events were the constant headline, did you ever detect tension even with brethren? Did you ever contribute to the tension even with brethren? I submit to you this thought. If we understood Proverbs 1, 1 through 7, we wouldn't do that. If we understood the purpose of Proverbs and the thrust of what Solomon has to say, we wouldn't be guilty of that. We would resolve to consider situations and look at them from opposing viewpoints. We'd resolve to forfeit our own prejudice. We'd resolve to be objective in our research. We would resolve to look at all of the details and ask if there might be some statistics and some facts that would actually cause us to change our minds regarding our assumptions and presumptions, and perhaps even the news that fits our consumption. So, how often has it been the case that we as people were convinced that something had to be fact, and that was the case? And what really should have happened is we were willing to look at the big picture that we could see, and there were enough missing gaps and enough absences in evidence that we would have to say, well, maybe this or maybe that. But when it comes down to it, I can't know. What does it mean to jump to conclusions? To arrive at a conclusion that's not warranted by the evidence. Those things being said, when we will look at the evidence, when we will take the approach that's described throughout the book of Proverbs, but especially at the beginning, it's not only going to change our perspective of the world around us and our interaction with the knowledge and facts of the world around us. If we'll have the mindset that's described at the outset of Proverbs, we'll understand each other better. We'll understand our neighbor, saints, be they sinners. We'll understand people better. Let's take a look at Proverbs 1 through 7 from the perspective of the power of actually thinking. Because when we jump to conclusions and arrive at conclusions that are not warranted by the evidence, what we've done is decide, thinking just takes too much effort. I'm going to arrive at a conclusion all on my lonesome. I'm just going to reach this decision. Proverbs focuses on the use of the mind, using the mind to know wisdom and instruction. Now, to know wisdom. To know means to possess the information, as we discussed last week. Wisdom means knowing how to use what you know. And as it's used in the book of Proverbs, wisdom also pertains to the feature of a person that desires to continue learning. A wise man will hear and will increase learning. A wise man doesn't assume that he has all the answers, and he doesn't assume that he knows everything. In the human mindset, there is an inherent desire to be right. There's a way which seems right to a man, Proverbs 14:12. All the ways of man are right in his own eyes, Proverbs 16. Yes, we desire to be right. That desire to be right often becomes so overwhelming that it becomes a refusal to be wrong. Humility is willing to say, I don't know. Humility is willing to say, I was wrong. To know wisdom and instruction, wisdom is going to demand the sort of humility that says, I'll use the information that I know, but I'm also going to keep learning. Side note, 2 + 2 = 4. Is anything going to change that fact? You learned that early in school, right? I mean, by the 6th grade, I had that down. I knew 2 + 2 = 4. And after that, as we learned subtraction, multiplication, division, exponents, did any added learning change the fact that 2 + 2 = 4? We can continue to learn, hone our understanding, our skills, our use of knowledge, without it changing fundamentally what we already know to be factual and true. Now that applies to our learning of God's Word as well, and to our learning of how to interact with people. The truth is the truth. Nothing's going to change God's standard for how to become a Christian, God's pattern for what the church is to be, or the organization of it. Nothing is going to change God's standard for morality. But the more we grow and learn, the more we're able to discern good from evil, Hebrews 5:12 through 14. The more we grow and learn, the more we're also able to discern victim from offender. And the better we're able to discern conclusion from assumption. So, moving forward, to know wisdom and instruction. Now, the word translated instruction, musar, it's from yasar, it connects to the idea of being taught. And it can actually connect to the idea of a beating. How many people never had certain things that you never learned until there was a belt involved? How many people had to have some knowledge beaten into them? The Proverbs writer says, foolishness is bound in the heart of a child, but the rod of correction will drive it far from him. Did you know that there is actually a direct connection between a child's brain and his backside? The rod of correction drives it far from him. Here's our point. Instruction involves learning. Sometimes learning is tough. We don't necessarily learn by osmosis. We have to learn by paying attention, and sometimes we have to learn by experience, the hard way. To know wisdom and instruction. The goal of Proverbs is to know how to learn. Do we really know how to learn? The first principle in learning is the willingness to say, I don't know everything. Or maybe we can put it another way. There's more for me to learn. To know wisdom and instruction. To perceive. Use your mind to know. Use your mind to understand. The word translated understand comes from that Hebrew word being, as we've discussed it already. It pertains to the idea of applying a mental separation. It's the concept of dividing a thought or looking at a thought from multiple perspectives. Understanding. Have you ever heard someone say, my parents just don't understand me? It's a statement that gets made frequently. Or have you ever heard someone say, my spouse just doesn't understand me? What's meant by that? My parents don't understand me, or my spouse doesn't understand me. My spouse doesn't see the world the way I do. Doesn't see life the way I do. My spouse doesn't understand why I view things the way I view them. Understanding is going to require effort. And in order for me to understand any person, that's going to require me to listen. Use your mind to understand. Now, Solomon says to perceive the words of understanding, to understand the words of understanding. You might think of that as the words that teach understanding. Or maybe to understand how to understand someone else or something else by heeding the words. There are times that we're not able to see someone else's perspective until we've stood in those shoes. We often use the phrase, walk a mile in my shoes. There's a great benefit to being able to step back and consider the best of our ability something from another person's perspective. Use the mind to understand. The mind requires effort. Thinking. Considering. Use the mind to understand the words of understanding and the worth of understanding. If we were to link to Proverbs 18:2, the fool has no delight in understanding. He just wants his heart to discover itself. He just wants to say what's on his mind. We've already referenced that verse in previous classes and connected it to what we call Facebook, which is just an echo chamber for people to say, for people to voice their opinions so that they can hear other people that agree with them say, yes, sir. That's all it is. And then whenever you don't agree, I'm going to unfriend you. Proverbs 28:16. The prince that lacks understanding or wants understanding is also a great oppressor. Without a proper application of understanding and seeing things from other people's point of view, my leadership is going to be oppressive. Christians are leaders in some capacity or another. If you were to go to Titus chapter 2 and you read through the first 10 verses, Paul addresses the older men, the older women, the younger women, and then the younger men. And in each one, either explicitly or implicitly, there is a direct connection to the responsibility to teach. How effective is the teacher that doesn't take the time to stop to understand the student? How effective is the coach that doesn't stop to take the time to understand the players? How effective is the parent that doesn't endeavor to understand the thought processes and perspective of the child? Question: as it pertains to parenting, who should we expect to be able to view ideas and concepts from broader perspectives? The parents or the children? Who ought to be more equipped to divide mentally and to exercise understanding? Or maybe we put it this way: who should have the experience that enables that person to see things from the other one's point of view? The 30-year-old parent who was once in the shoes of the 3-year-old child, or the 3-year-old child that can't even count to 30? Who should we expect to exercise understanding? So, if we're in roles of leadership, that means we need to be exercising understanding. We're trying to lead the lost to Christ. If all we endeavor to do is browbeat and hammer, instead of exercising understanding, well, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. And sometimes we might lead the lost to water, but we've not made them think because we've not exercised understanding, and they're not going to go into it. They're not going to accept what the Word teaches. Understand the worth of understanding, because without it, we're just a bunch of fools spouting our opinions. We're just a bunch of oppressors leading people against their wills. The power of actually thinking. Use the mind to know, use the mind to understand, and use the mind to learn. Proverbs 1:3, to receive the instruction of wisdom. There's that word instruction again. This is discipline. This is correction. To receive the instruction of wisdom. The word translated wisdom is not the chakma that is utilized elsewhere in the book of Proverbs. This is sakal. Sakal means to be or to make or to act intelligent. It connects to the idea of perception or awareness. Well, wisdom has to be aware. Wisdom has to be perceptive. And the idea here is to receive the instruction of wisdom. To receive the instruction that comes from being aware. That comes from having a perspective that looks at and recognizes the details and the facts that are around us. To receive the instruction of wisdom, to receive the instruction of justice. So we want to receive teaching in wise behavior, how to act intelligently, with awareness, and to receive instruction in right behavior. The word translated justice in the King James Version is translated righteousness in the American Standard and in the English Standard. The Hebrew word is tzedek, and it carries the idea that would most commonly resonate in our minds of righteousness. That which is morally right, naturally right, that which is right according to law or custom. The word tzedek simply pertains to that which is clearly, factually right. And everything that's right is going to be a reflection of God. So, to receive the instruction of wisdom, justice, or righteousness, there's instruction that's in righteousness. By the way, that sounds an awful lot like a passage from the New Testament, doesn't it? All Scripture is given by inspiration of God and is profitable for doctrine, reproof, correction, and instruction in righteousness. The goal of Proverbs was to teach instruction in justice or righteousness. It takes effort to learn what's right. Because there's a way that seems right, but at the end thereof are the ways of death. Wise behavior, right behavior, and to receive instruction in just behavior. The word translated just is the Hebrew word mishpat. This is the idea of a verdict, a formal decree. It could be a sentence in a courtroom setting, or it is a declaration of the just consequence. Ultimately, it can even pertain to the declaration of one's rights, but it's a verdict or a declaration of just, judicially right behavior. Proverbs 16:10. Notice how this word connects to the responsibilities of the king. Proverbs 16, picking up at verse 10. A divine sentence is in the lips of the king. His mouth transgresseth not in judgment. Now there's a sense in which this can be connected to the standard that the Israelite kings were to be reflecting, but there's also a sense in which this connects to the fact that God has ordained judgment. Now look at verse 10 of Proverbs 16 and connect with verse 11, because the word translated judgment at the end of verse 10 is tzedek. And that is the first word of verse 11. A just tzedek, weight and balance are the Lord's. Justice in terms of a divine sentence, that comes from God. And justice in terms of weights and balances come from God. Who made the specific gravity of copper? Who gave to each element and each compound its characteristics? Who made the law of gravity? And who made the law of gravity to operate in such a way that that which is of a specific mass on one side of a scale is going to balance with that which is of equal weight on the other side of the scale? A just weight and balance are the Lord's. All the weights of the bag are His work. God defines what's right, and when we look and utilize what's right and fair and balanced, we're reflecting the justice and the fairness that God has ordained. So, question. Well, let's actually add one more to this. To receive the instruction of wisdom, justice, judgment, and equity. The word translated equity is the Hebrew word meshar. It means evenness. Now it can connect to prosperity and concord. Proverbs 8:6. Whereas Proverbs 8:8 has wisdom saying, all the words of my mouth are in righteousness, tzedek. Proverbs 8:6, hear, for I will speak of excellent things, and the opening of my mouth shall be right. Mishar things, that which is fair, that which is balanced. Raise your hand if you've never said these words. That's not fair. Was that the defining statement of your childhood? That's not fair. That's not fair. How well equipped are we to identify fairness without a standard? Anyone ever seen the film The Newton Boys? The Newton Boys depicts this family in the late 1800s, not long after the Civil War, that decided that several brothers decided that they were going to start making their money by robbing banks. And one of the interesting things about this group of the Newtons is that none of them were ever killed in their chosen profession, if you will. Matter of fact, that actually makes them unique among so many of the famous American bank robbers. But the mindset of the ringleader of the group, his name was Willis Newton, but the mindset, at least as portrayed in the film, was this: I was done wrong, and when it's all finished, everything's going to be fair. And if it's not fair with everybody, it's going to be fair on my side of the fence. What's that mean? that by the time the dust settles, everything's either going to be balanced or I'll be on top. That's not justice. That's not fairness. That's not equity. The book of Proverbs teaches us to look at the idea of justice and fairness and equity, to look at that which reflects God's standard of right, God's standard of balance, God's standard of equal, and to let that define who we are. To receive the instruction of wisdom, wise behavior, justice, righteous behavior, judgment, just behavior, and equity, equal behavior. Do we know how to act wisely, righteously, justly, and equitably? Or are we too busy looking for ways to be on top? The power of actually thinking. You use your mind to know, use your mind to understand, use your mind to learn, and use your mind to teach. Proverbs 1:4, to give subtlety to the simple, to the young man knowledge and discretion. To give subtlety, that is prudence, to the simple. Prudence is an awareness that reacts to the information. Proverbs 21:3, a prudent man foresees the evil and hides himself. But the simple are those that are gullible, the ones that are susceptible to being misled. Well, we read the word simple several times last week when we looked at wisdom calling out to the simple. Whoso is simple, let him turn in hither, Proverbs 9. But in Proverbs 9, there's also the strange woman that says, whoso is simple, let him turn in hither. Wisdom calls for the gullible to come and eat from her table so they'll stop being gullible. But the strange woman, the temptress, calls for the gullible to come and, well, partake of what she supplies so that they'll stay gullible. The purpose of Proverbs, to get us out of being gullible. Have you ever in your life been guilty of being gullible? Have you ever been the kind of person that believed what you were told at face value without stopping to think, maybe I need to double check? Here's a thought to consider. Here's a thought that will challenge those who are the simple as described in Proverbs. I'm not calling a person a liar just because I don't believe what the person says. There are three sides to every story. His, and his. And if I'm only hearing what one person has to say, well, the book of Proverbs says, the way of man is just in his own eyes. Or every man seems right or just in his own cause, but his neighbor comes and searches him. The point being, every person can make an argument for why he's right in this situation of conflict or contention, right up until you listen to the other side of the story. Have you ever, in all sincerity and in all honesty, been convinced that you were right up until you were able to step back and see the big picture? No, I'm the only one that's ever happened to him. There are times when the information that we share about a situation or a conflict or a contention or a strife is told from us only seeing one side. And the people to whom we tell it are only hearing one side. There's a reason why Jesus said, go to your neighbor, go to your brother, tell him his fault between thee and him alone. If he'll hear thee, thou hast gained thy brother. That requires objectivity on the part of the one that has been wronged or allegedly wronged, and the one that has allegedly done the wrong. Both must be willing to exercise understanding to hear each other. But what tends to happen is one side goes and talks to everyone else except the one that has allegedly done the wrong or the one that has allegedly been wronged, and tells his side of the story or her side of the story. What's that do to relationships? What's that do to the connection between brethren? What's that do to the church that Jesus shed his blood to purchase? the souls that He died to save. To give subtlety, prudence to the simple. One of the key ideas in Proverbs is not to be gullible. We might call it the law of rationality. To arrive at conclusions that are warranted by the evidence. And there are times that we need to get more than just one side of the story. The simple believeth every word. The simple fail to listen with discernment. There are times that the story that you tell me, or the story that you tell your spouse, or the story that you tell someone else is an accurate account of your perspective. But what I or your spouse or anyone else must remember is that your perspective is limited. And there may be more details. Sometimes there are details that maybe my mind could have remembered, but I've gotten so focused on these other details that which is peripheral has become obscured. If we'll utilize the mindsets taught at the very beginning of Proverbs, then we won't be the kind of people that shoot first and ask questions later. Matter of fact, later in the book of Proverbs, this point is made. He that answers a matter before he heareth it, it is folly and shame unto him. What happens when you're taking a test and you only read half the question and then you write an answer? Tish, you're a school teacher. You ever have that happen with some of your students? How well does that typically go? Big red X? When we try to give an opinion or a determination or counsel on a situation that people bring to us before we've even heard the entirety of the situation, or when we in roles of leadership, perhaps as parents or as spouses, endeavor to respond to a child or a spouse without fully hearing what's being said, when we make unwarranted assumptions, we will be the one jumping to conclusions. And how's that tend to go? Here, we'll imitate Miss Tish. So, use your mind to teach. And if we're going to teach, we're going to give subtlety to the simple. But if we're going to give subtlety and prudence to the simple or gullible, that means we've got to be careful not to be the gullible. And to the young man being the one that's inexperienced, the young man, the one that doesn't have as much life resume, to the young man, knowledge and discretion. This idea of discretion being the applying knowledge to bring about a desired outcome. Now, use your mind to know, to understand, to learn, to teach. Proverbs 1:7. After all that's said in verses 4 and 5, the wise man says, a wise man will hear and increase learning. A man of understanding will attain to wise counsels. Keep on learning. This is part of learning. To understand a proverb, the interpretation, the words of the wise and their dark sayings. If we're going to use understanding, we have to continue learning. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Here's where it all starts. Do we utilize our mental capacity to know and understand and learn and teach? Do we utilize our mental capacity for God? There's another preaching family that we have so enjoyed the time that we've been able to spend with them whenever we were all in the same place. They live in Texas now. But the wife in this family, whenever she would chastise her sons, she would use the words, engage your mind. I told her, I said, that's a whole lot better than what I say. I just say, use your brain. Are we using our brains? Are we engaging our minds to make sure that we know, that we truly know, instead of operating on assumptions? To make sure that we understand, and that we truly understand, instead of operating with blinders? Are we using our minds to learn? Humble enough to admit that we don't know everything, but confident enough in God's instructions to know that we can understand. And are we using our minds to teach? What's the greatest way to teach? By instruction or by example? We remember the examples more than we remember the words, right? If we're going to teach the subtlety, giving subtlety to the simple and to the young man knowledge and discretion, then it's going to be upon us to exhibit it and live it. We'll call this an introduction to the principles of Proverbs. When we pick up again next week, we're going to look at some details pertaining to rhyme and rhythm, not that I have any, and in moving forward, some other matters pertaining to an overall outline of the book as we really begin delving into a chapter-by-chapter study. Thank you so much for your time this evening.